Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the Cloverfield Paradox. The Cloverfield franchise has always been sort of an interesting one. It's probably the most successful anthology sci-fi franchise that has ever been made. Most of the time, you have a film franchise that has an anthology idea. It either doesn't work out, or they get to two movies and that's it. Whereas this has managed to have three and even a fourth one that's supposedly going to happen later. And the other entries in this franchise, the original Cloverfield and then 10 Cloverfield Lane, both take different takes on a sci-fi movie. They're kind of like, the original was a found footage monster movie. The second one was this different tense kind of survival film, and they weren't like the average kind of thing you see from sci-fi films either, so it made them actually kind of interesting. You're like, not only is this an interesting kind of anthology kind of series, but you're also getting like different kind of sci-fi stories in this franchise, and that's kind of cool, or at least different takes on a sci-fi story. Cloverfield Paradox isn't that at all. In fact, it's something you've seen a million times before, and thus it is not very interesting. Like, everything that happens in this space station is something that pretty much happened in Alien or Event Horizon or countless other movies before it, and it doesn't really feel interesting anymore. It feels boring. This is kind of a combination of Jason X and a crappy Jason kind of origin story movie that even Friday the 13th was smart enough not to actually make. Why Cloverfield Paradox exists and tries to like both explain the franchise, which is something that you would never want to do, that's something horror franchises always try to do, is explain the villain, explain the circumstances, but that's something you as an audience don't actually want. That's probably why people get less interested in these franchises as they go on, and it seemed like something Cloverfield could avoid ever having to explain itself. Whether that's because of the reshoots this film had to kind of like make this film work a little better, in fact makes it worse. When you have a film that's basically trying to do the haunted house but in a space station thing that Alien had done before it, I guess that was a spaceship, but whatever, you're kind of left with a film that just feels like something you've seen before, so it's like a crappy kind of version of an interesting riff that someone did before it, except this isn't interesting. Like, yeah, it's a cool idea to do a haunted house movie in space with alternate dimensions and everything, but it's not really a cool or interesting idea to do that when other people have done it before, making this film feel like the kind of sci-fi as thriller idea that you've seen more times and forgotten more movies that do this than you ever care to think about. The Cloverfield Paradox, I guess maybe calling it the Cloverfield Paradox makes sense because it is a paradox of an idea that they thought that this could be in the same line as the other Cloverfield films. It even does the crappy things that franchise do that you hate early on in its third movie. I don't want to know that they did this weird God particle thing, made all these dimensions happen, and that's what caused the Cloverfield universe. It's the same way, like, I don't need a Twilight Zone episode that explains that all the Twilight Zone episodes were in the same universe either. If there is an episode like that, I feel like there probably isn't, which is probably why we still like that a lot more. But this whole idea of like everything's connected is such a lazy kind of screenwriting and storytelling idea. J.J. Abrams might be Mr. Mystery Box, but honestly it feels like he's Mr. Mystery Box because he doesn't actually understand how to keep a mystery going. He just understands the hype of a mystery. And Cloverfield Paradox, obviously because its release and everything like that, is really all hype, because once you get into and open the box of the Cloverfield Paradox, there's really nothing there, or at least nothing you'd ever be interested in. It doesn't really know what to do with its story. It has some pretty big concepts that it doesn't really flesh out, like this whole God particle thing. Like, it mentions they had this whole theory and everything. Could we explain that theory? Could we actually understand how the world got into this place, how things got to be the way they are? But really, like, they have this whole idea that they'll make unlimited energy. How is that supposed to work? This isn't like a cool thing where they're like, they don't explain this thing because it's so interesting and there's so many other ideas. You don't need it to know that. But in this case, it felt like I sort of did need to know a lot of this crap, and you just like didn't get around to telling me because of their own inadequacies as filmmakers, really. Cloverfield Paradox often feels like a film that was shot by several different people in huge sections of plot and interesting plot, were cut down or even cut out for reasons that don't make like very much sense to me. And I sort of don't get like why you'd want this in an anthology kind of film. It like just feels like it could be any old sci-fi movie, and script wise it really was. I don't know why they had this script for years. I don't know why they believed in it so much. Maybe it like read better, or they accidentally made the wrong script and there was like a better script somewhere and it was like a total oops on their part. I'm gonna assume that's probably it, because there's nothing that really stands out of this as a concept or an idea that makes you go, oh wow, the God particle, whatever the fuck this is. There's nothing that's really that good about this, and there's too many random things that suddenly happen. It really just feels like the off movie in a franchise, and I like the whole idea of the Cloverfield kind of anthology thing. I think it's a cool idea. You know, it's actually neat that J.J. Abrams got this to be actually successful and sustainable and is able to make these films. I felt pretty let down by this, and I felt kind of unsurprised and uncaring about what happened. Certainly this falls in line with various Netflix films. Obviously this was bought by Netflix, like Bright, where it just feels like, you know, you're trying to be nice to it at the beginning, but by the end you really don't give a shit. And I think Bright might be a much worse movie. The Cloverfield Paradox does that in kind of the uniform, boring, kind of mid-level kind of Hollywood way that makes you, you know, sort of like not very nostalgic for these kind of films. Opening at like 8th in the box office or something like that makes you just, you know, realize that this is something someone put on after watching a ton of movies because someone liked some weird concept within it. But this doesn't even really have that. It doesn't have an interesting shot. It doesn't have like a cool like special effect or anything like that. It just felt like they had reasons to do these various things, but they weren't really having any fun with the concept. If they had like a found footage like space station movie, which I think they've tried before and failed at, other people, not Cloverfield, that could be something, or there was some sort of a different take on it. But what was so different about this? Like, you made a crappy space station movie wrapped within a crappy origin movie. What did you think like the great outcome was going to be? This wasn't a compelling thriller or anything like that. It might have a great cast, and I think a lot of the cast really tries to get this to work. They seem like really committed to this movie, like in their performances, which like kudos to them, but too bad like this totally sucks. Particularly like Gugu Mbatha-Raw, I thought she was really good, and she gets sequences like even like having a tearful sequence that's similar to Matthew McConaughey's in Interstellar. I actually thought she actually like really puts her all into that, and obviously she's from that episode of Black Mirror, which she was also good in. I think she puts all her convictions into this part and dedicates herself. It shows like how hungry of an actor she is. Daniel Bruhl, unfortunately, like often like tries to make complexities and interesting performances out of these characters that just feel very stock and uninteresting. The only thing I was surprised Zhang Ziyi was in this. I didn't actually know she was in this. I was like, oh cool. And Chris O'Dowd, who really does feel like he's in a different movie. I don't think this movie really understood how to balance its characters. It felt like there were tons of suggestions from different filmmakers and ideas from different producers, and no one truly knew how to like sort of filter this into being a complete whole. And even when you have more of the complete whole sections in this, you kind of didn't care that it even was that. The Cloverfield Paradox is a haunted house movie in space with a disappearing Earth thing, but it doesn't manage to find interesting things about that. The idea of like meshing dimensions together and messing with space-time, you could have done some really interesting surreal things with it, but instead you kind of did the boring surreal things that somebody else did like 5 movies before you, and like I'm supposed to really care at this point. It felt like sort of lazy and also like uninformed on the genre it was actually making a movie about. It's like sort of had seen Alien once, or like, oh, I could do something with a hand and like a ship eats someone and a mysterious person shows up. It's like if someone watched Solaris and fell asleep during it and assumed it was probably something like this. There's so much potential within the Cloverfield franchise, and maybe there's a little potential in this idea, and the idea of like just an Earth that disappears and kind of the bigness of that, and what you know, a moral you could say with it. But the only moral at the end of this is like, oh hey, this is all connected, and you're like, oh fuck you. That's the moral. I don't think there's any moral you can get out of the Cloverfield Paradox, except that the people who made this and the studio that made this cared so little that they'd make something as pathetic as this. It's so unremarkable and unrememberable that you'd have to do a major kind of big advertising push during the Super Bowl just so people would still talk about it maybe in a year ago. Hey, remember when they did that thing and I watched that crappy movie? And that's like the only thing that's notable about it. It's probably good it did that advertising campaign, because like I would have totally forgotten this movie after I saw it. You know, it like made this kind of a must-see in a certain regard, except for the movie itself is not must-see at all. 10 Cloverfield Lane was a movie I really liked. And Cloverfield might be, you know, kind of a mainstream blockbuster version of found footage within a monster movie, and that, you know, isn't maybe the greatest thing in the world, but at least it had the chutzpah to be, you know, a kind of a different take on that. Cloverfield Paradox is just a crappy space station thriller haunted house movie. Like, there's nothing, that's it. That's all we're getting from this. Like, there's nothing more here. This is your big anthology sci-fi thing where you can do all sorts of different ideas and theories and stories and plop Cloverfield on it, and we'll come out and see it. And it's a cool idea of J.J. Abrams to take original science fiction, lower budget things and kind of like get people to see them. I think if 10 Cloverfield Lane didn't have Cloverfield on it, not as many people would have seen it. Nobody would have really given a shit. But because of that, a lot more people did. And it was interesting that he found a way to kind of bend franchises to tell different and original stories. But if you're going to do something like that and take on the world and make mainstream Hollywood make kind of different films and promote them like major blockbusters, then why just make an average sort of blockbuster? Like, what's the point of all this anymore? And I think the Cloverfield Paradox kind of never really makes you question the whole idea of this franchise in itself. Like, well, why do this if you're just going to make something that we can see from anything else? You know, why are you even really doing this? What's the point of explaining it? You know, there's no real point to it at all. There's no moral throughout it. There's no interesting take on it. You're just like watching a shitty space station movie where like crazy crap happens, and that's just like, and that's kind of not really going to do it for me. I don't really know this director, but I was really unimpressed by this film. I think it is probably one of the least remarkable films that became a big deal I've seen in a long time, and it's probably one of the least memorable as well. If you can even remember anything from this movie in 6 months other than the marketing campaign, I would be shocked, fucking shocked, because this movie is so unremarkable. It's like begging for something interesting to happen to it, and it never really will, other than this Netflix thing. It's probably a godsend because this will be remembered for its crazy, different, kind of game-changing release. But in terms of just the movie itself, we're taking away how it was released. Just the movie itself is a fairly insanely unremarkable, boring film that you've seen a lot of other movies do in a lot better ways than Cloverfield Paradox even gets close to touching. It just takes little tidbits from each of these things and hopes that maybe it'll be an interesting story and a movie you'd halfway sit through. But it's also halfway trying to get me to give a fuck when clearly it doesn't give a fuck enough to kind of do something interesting with a franchise that's bursting with potential to give new filmmakers and new ideas and interesting filmmakers and interesting sci-fi ideas a really good and really great spotlight. And the fact that they wasted all that on this kind of a movie is probably one of the more shameful franchise plays I've seen in a long time. It's worse than a crappy sequel. It's a franchise that has the potential to do something new and interesting, and kind of just giving you that kind of traditional kind of crappy movie is really just flat out disappointing. And I think it kind of shows that think that any of this was a good idea kind of shows their lack of foresight and probably kind of taking down a franchise that could do much more interesting things with it is probably one of the more disappointing ideas, is that they thought that this movie was a good idea at all. So if you have seen the Cloverfield Paradox and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.